So next up, we move to our panel. So I invite our panelists, Tony, Michelle, Valerie, Lewis and Noel to please join us on stage. Okay, the title of our panel, panel number 2, is Realising the Bioenergy Potential Within Our Policy and Regulatory Frameworks, and we're delighted to welcome our panelists today. So just to introduce our panelists, Tony Collins is Principal Officer in the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications in the Heat and Business Energy Efficiency Division. Tony's responsibility is leading on the heat policy, district heating, and the non-domestic energy efficiency. And Tony is deputising for Barry Quinlan, who unfortunately couldn't make it due to another appointment today. So thanks, Tony, for joining us. Next up is Michelle Kearney. So Michelle is the Bioenergy Policy Lead at the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Michelle holds a BSc in Chemistry and PhD in Electrochemistry and over 20 years experience in policy development, and is a Bioenergy Policy Lead in the department, focusing on energy efficiency, deployment of renewable technologies at a farm level, and the supply of bioenergy feedstocks as key agricultural contributors to the energy transition. Michelle has also project managed the agricultural contribution to the National Climate Action Plan, and most recently has become involved in policy around carbon farming and key opportunity for sustainable farming practices. Previously worked in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment and Forfos. So we welcome Michelle and thanks very much for joining us. Our next speaker or panelist is Valerie Hughes. Valerie is with the Energy, IrBEA and Adaptation Division in the Department of Transport. Valerie leads on the implementation of the renewable fuels for transport policy within the Department of Transport. And this work sits within the department's Climate Action Division, which is responsible for developing and delivering climate action policies for the transport sector in line with Ireland's national and international obligations. Our next speaker and panelist is Lewis Gay-Tarazona, who is the SEI Programme Manager for Decarbonised Heat and Bioenergy. We compliment Lewis on his new role in SEI, and he manages the SEI Bioenergy Research Strategy, which includes managing the Renewable Heat Bioenergy Team and other decarbonisation ResH team members. So thanks for joining us today. And finally, our fifth panellist is Noel Gavigan. Noel is the Technical Executive with the Irish Bioenergy Association. So Noel has a long number of years working with the association and is specifically tasked with the management and administration of the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme and working with members on technical aspects associated with the bioenergy sectors. Noel has an intrinsic knowledge of the sector and acts as a project manager on the European Innovation Partnership Department of Agriculture funded Small Biogas Demonstration Programme. So that's the introduction. So if I could first turn to Tony and maybe just pose a couple of questions, Tony, just to start the discussion. So can you give us a broad outline of the various policies that DECC are pursuing to decarbonising heat across the various different sectors and temperatures that exist?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, so I suppose first off, you've all heard about the National Heat Study that the SEAI produced earlier this year, which really gives us an evidence base to move forward with the policies and the steps that we're taking. In terms of background structures, we're putting in place a heat and built environment delivery task force. This is one of the high-level task forces that the Minister has identified needs to be put in place to deliver in the space, so in the heat and built environment space. And we hope to have the initial meeting of that group this month. The heat study, as you've heard earlier as well, calls out the impact district heating can have in the renewable heat space, with potential for up to 50% of heat coming from district heating. So there's been a lot of activity there in terms of the establishment of a steering group that is to report to government by the end of the year. There's a number of working groups feeding in there. So we're putting the final touches, I suppose, to the initial draft of the report to government. So we're in a good space to report by the end of the year. There's a number of existing schemes already in place. They're administered by the SEAI. and they've undergone reviews by the SEAI recently as well to improve the impact, I suppose, in the space, and then obviously the renewable heat obligation as well that has been discussed. So there's a lot of activity in the area.
And just on the renewable heat obligation scheme, it's certainly of interest to a lot of our attendees today. So it is our understanding that there's going to be a renewable heat obligation introduced. Would you be able to give us, Tony, just the specific details of the timelines and what's involved in the process of implementing or introducing a renewable heat obligation?
Sure. So yeah, you're right. The decision has been taken to introduce the obligation in the heat sector just to ensure the level of energy supplied. A level of energy supplied in the heat sector comes from renewable sources. So there was a public consultation was already taking place back in 2021. In light of the changed situation for energy prices in an international context, we re-examined the necessity to introduce a renewable heat obligation. So off the back of that, the decision, like I say, was taken to introduce it. We're in a scoping process at the moment in terms of design and how that obligation would look. We're working with the SEAI on that, so we hope to be going out for public consultation then, or technical consultation early next year.
Okay. With the view to then finalising the details of the scheme following the consultation and introduction, then is it in 2024? Is that the plan at this point?
By 2024 is the decision that was taken, yeah. So
okay.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. Just following on from the excellent work which you pointed out of SEI in developing their heat study, can you give us an outline as to how that heat study will now translate into policy? So is the department working on an overall heat policy? Can you just update us on that?
Yeah, so yeah, as you say, the heat study is there, it provides the evidence base. It's very detailed, very, very in-depth study. The next logical step, I suppose, is a policy in and around heat. So the National Energy Security Framework calls it out that we develop a heat policy statement. So again, working with the SEAI, drawing on the findings of the heat study, we're in a drafting phase there. We've internal consultations with my own colleagues internally within the department, because it obviously cross-cuts in a lot of sectors. And we hope to start expanding the consultation piece there to include other government departments, and then even more broadly again after that.
Okay. And just if I could conclude at this point with you, Tony, by just asking one final question. Obviously, the government have agreed the broader sectoral ceiling emissions. Can you give us some outline of your thoughts in terms of the contribution that bioenergy can make to the heating sector and the industrial sector's targets? Specifically, we have the SSRH, which is a very good program, and we'll discuss that later with our SEI representative on a future panel. But just can you give us a broad outline of the role you see for bioenergy within the broader and achieving those targets in terms of emission ceilings targets which have been set?
Yeah, so I suppose we're well aware that in terms of renewable heat, we're behind the curve. In 2020, we were at 6.8% renewable heat with a target of 12%. So there's a body of work to be done to catch up and to start meeting the targets. I suppose we're in a position where some of the sectors have to be built up from a very low base, district heating, biomethane being two in particular. There are, I suppose, some supports in place, and we heard you mentioned the SSRH, and your previous speaker spoke to it as well. So again, that's one of the supports that's administered through the SEAI to incentivize renewable heat. They are challenging targets, and we are looking, given the space we're in, we're probably looking at delivery mid to late 2030s in terms of some of the technologies. But the decision has been taken, I suppose, by government to deliver up to 5.7 terawatt hours of biomethane, which will equate to approximately 10% of gas use. So there's a very key role to be played there by and significant contribution to be made.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony. If I could move to Michelle, and particularly on that point, the target set for agriculture and the recent announced emissions limits are challenging, but there is potential for bioenergy and biogas, biomethane to contribute to this. So can you just outline, Michelle, your views in terms of that potential?
Absolutely, Sean, and thanks. And I suppose, yes, look, just reflecting, I suppose, on the sectoral emission ceilings for agriculture and the 25% reduction, I mean, firmly, I suppose, embedded in that reduction was the role that the sector can play in the whole renewable energy space, but in particular, I suppose, the bioenergy space. And that 5.7 terawatt hour is very much dependent on, I suppose, building on the National Heat Study in terms of the feedstocks that are available there or potentially could be available in terms of animal manures, in terms of grass silage, and also mobilising our food waste. We in the department see, I suppose, the whole role and production of biomethane as providing a very valuable land diversification opportunity for farmers, both in terms of income and also in terms of land activity, as well as actually helping us, I suppose, with the chemical reduction fertiliser targets that we currently have within the Climate Action Plan, and the whole area there of the use of digestate. So I think it's really important, Sean, that it's embedded within our sector and that we move forward.
Okay, and just in terms of specific measures then that could mobilise the biomethane industry or bioenergy industry in general, and what will the Department of Agriculture's role be in that mobilisation?
I suppose, look, you know, this is like, and as Mary Donnelly said earlier, I mean, I suppose we need to look at the mobilisation of the 5.7 terawatt hours as, I mean, it is a significant energy type infrastructure project, Sean, and we look at this very much through, I suppose, lens of a couple of pillars, and as Tony has alluded to, you know, it's very much about aligning policies certainly around demand, certainly around supply, and we would all also see aligning with regulation and finance as well. Specifically within the department, I suppose our minister had announced within the budget that he's going to divert carbon tax money over the next 4 years in terms of a capital support. But as we would see in other jurisdictions, capital support alone is not sufficient, particularly to kickstart this industry. You know, we are starting from a very, very low base. We have about 35 biogas plants in establishment in Ireland in total. 2 are producing biomethane, and of those 12 are regulated under the animal byproducts. So there is a combination required of capital supports, of operational supports, and also aligning other I suppose, policies in terms of regulation and how we mobilise finance, because it is a significant project.
Okay, and just would you have a view, or and what would the view of the department be in terms of the size, the scale, the opportunity that a biogas/biomethane industry could be developed here? So,
look, I mean, this is, as said, a very large target, probably has a large number of plants that if we look at it from, I suppose, figures that are out there currently, if we were to deliver up to the 5.7 terawatt hours, you're probably looking at in the region of 150 to 200 anaerobic digestion plants of medium size, so you're looking at 1 to 2 megawatt plants. In terms of capital investment, and I suppose taking into account now, you know, the recent increases in construction costs, possibly in the region of about 1.5 billion to mobilise that particular industry. And then, you know, we need also an operational support, because that viability gap between natural gas and renewable gas will still be there, particularly within the long term. You know, currently we look at gas prices and we see that renewable gas is probably cheaper than natural gas, but certainly the markets would feel over the next couple of years that that will not be the case, that actually natural gas prices will come back down. So there's still that viability gap there that needs to somewhat be socialised between the large gas users.
I think the view of a lot of attendees today is that market certainly is a big, a very, very important requirement here. Would you have, or has the department any concerns that they would like to note in terms of the development of an industry that you'd like to share with us today?
Yeah, I mean, Sean, and I suppose, you know, reflecting Paul Dean's point earlier about credibility within the carbon budgets, there is a credibility, I suppose, in developing this industry and ensuring that it's developed in an absolute sustainable way. We have seen experience in other member states where that has not happened, and, you know, the whole bioenergy agenda has actually got a bad reputation. So, I mean, certainly whatever biomethane is produced here has to be driven by the sustainability criteria within the Renewable Energy Directive, like currently the RED 2, but also more importantly, and very conscious of the fact that as RED 3 is rolled out and as the sustainability criteria post-26 becomes more stringent, that plants actually have to comply with that. And I suppose it would be remiss of me not to mention at this point in time that the department has a key role to play in the regulation of animal byproducts, and as we move forward in terms of scaling the industry, we will be using more animal byproducts, and our veterinary colleagues would encourage any developer or any person thinking about getting involved in an anaerobic digestion industry to contact the department very early on in the process, because it does impact on the planning. It impacts on the scale and the design of particular plants.
Okay, thanks very much, Michelle. Just one final question for you. Obviously, the department has a remit in terms of the solid biomass and bioenergy area too. So, do you want to just outline the department's role in terms of mobilising the solid biomass industry?
Certainly, Sean, and I suppose my forestry colleagues who are in Meath today at the National Forestry Conference had just given me, I suppose, a few messages here in terms of to the audience today in terms of mobilising. So obviously, look, we're all very much aware in terms of the amount of biomass that's currently available. Figures that my forestry colleagues have given me is about 4.2 million cubic metres of biomass currently, and that's expected to grow to about 6 million cubic metres between now and 2030. So there will be a valuable resource there in terms of, I suppose, displacing fossil fuels, you know, in terms of that biomass supply and going into the energy system, but also more importantly as well is in terms of those energy intensive materials and how we actually use harvested wood products and cross-laminated timber in terms of our buildings. So there forestry colleagues will be putting out for consultation within the next 4 to 6 months, public consultation around the forestry strategy, and then with the expectation that there will be a new forestry programme in place at the beginning of 2023.
And just, it is the sustainable forest management thinning material that we're talking about here. There's obviously a huge opportunity for timber construction and all that. So just to very clearly be clear that it is thinning material that is sustainably sourced and managed through the process of forestation process, and gives value to the overall final clear fell by doing that thinning. So thanks, Michelle. So we'll come back to Noel on that particular point on the wood fuels in a couple of minutes. But before we go to Noel, I'll bring in Valerie. So Valerie, your department, the Department of Transport, published Renewable Fuels for Policy statement in November 2021. Can you just give us an update on the main points and policy areas that fall within that and the progress in terms of implementation to date?
Certainly, Sean. Well, as you said, the Minister published the Renewable Fuels for Transport Policy Statement in November last year following the publication of Climate Action Plan 2021, which included a number of targets for renewable transport fuels, including a target for an approximate B20 E10 in road transport by 2030. So the policy itself has been in place as the biofuel obligation was introduced in 2010 to implement our obligations under the Renewable Energy Directive. It started with a 4% blending target of biofuels in road transport, and that has increased over the years. It's as of 2022, it's a 13% by volume target, obligation, sorry. And we're looking to increase that. There are indicative blending rates published in the policy statement out to 25. The target out to 2030 will be subject to further analysis on sustainability and availability of renewable transport fuels. The obligation itself is administered by the National Reserves Agency. It requires providers of road transport fuels to blend biofuels, predominantly renewable transport fuels now, into the fossil fuels that they place on the market. The policy, there was a commitment in 2018 that the policy would continue to 2018 with a policy statement published every 2 years. So right now we're currently working on the next policy statement and its development as we continue to implement the policy measures that were set out in this policy statement, and would actually like to thank IrBEA and members for their participation and engagement this year as we consulted and engaged on the implementation of the policy. It contains a number of actions. We know, they were very ambitious. A lot has been achieved this year. Any of the policy actions that were aligned with the RED 2 were put in place by SI 350 of 2022. So that's things like putting the obligation on an energy basis, the implementation of, or the action to implement an advanced biofuel obligation within the obligation from 2023, and related advanced biofuel buyout to incentivise that blending. Said it's on an energy basis, that it sets out that by 2030 we'll have phased out high ILOC risk biofuels. And before that, from 2023, they will be limited to 2019 levels and those who put biofuels on the market 2019. We do have more to do, but I know you're going to ask me about E10 in a minute as well, so that's to come.
Well, just on the biofuels obligation scheme, obviously it's a key pillar of our renewable transport policy. You wouldn't probably, by listening to the discourse that happens in media and everything, you would think that or not know that it even existed. But a key driver of that is obviously increasing the blending rates of the various different fuels. So Giuliani earlier would have talked about the biodiesel and the potential for B12 and B20, so that's 12% and 20% increase the blending rate of biodiesel in diesel. Our colleagues in Ethanol Europe and James very strong on the E10 and the need for the introduction of E10. So could you give us an update? I know that the department has published an engagement piece on E10, an awareness campaign, but really people here today are looking to know when E10 is going to be introduced, because the market needs that certainty as well, and procurement personnel need that certainty. So would you be able to give us any insights into that?
Absolutely. So to implement E10 requires legislation, so that is going to be done through the Minister for the Environment. He is, there's a piece of legislation that on the oil contingency. So measures to give the Minister regulation-making powers, including specifying a percentage of renewables in petroleum products, will be included in that legislation. It's for government approval today. So that will give the Minister regulation-making powers for E10. As you said...
just E10 or B12 and
it is E10,
specifically.
So specifically for E10, the regulation-making power will be there as per the policy statement commitment to transition to E10 as a standard grade of fuel 2023. So that, as I said, that will give the Minister the regulation-making power to put E10 in place, noting that Northern Ireland intends to phase in E10 from the 1st of November. So that also notes then that E10 throughout the island of Ireland as a standard grade. We will be looking, having heard feedback from our stakeholders, we will be looking at, that will include the implementation period for that to allow the transition and use of existing stocks. Again, the intention will be to specify a minimum amount of ethanol to ensure that E10 is there. E10 is allowed right now under Fuel Quality Directive, but with market conditions, we know that that is not happening. The policy encouraged that, but the feedback that the department got very clearly from our stakeholders was for a mandate. So that's why we're doing that.
So the legislation has been approved today. So how long?
So the process is that government gives approval for drafting of legislation. That is going to Cabinet today. for approval. Following that, it will go for drafting. We understand that the legislation will be prioritised and introduced into the Oireachtas to go through the democratic process. As I said, we understand that legislation is a priority for government. So then that should allow, subject to that process, implementation.
Okay, thanks for the update on that, Valerie. Just as a final question, IrBEA published Transport in Ireland, a pathway to halving emissions that report in 2021. It set out how the current EV targets need to be achieved, increased biofuel blendings, efficiency measures, and indeed the uses of HVO and indeed biogas, biomethane. Could I ask you a question specifically on the potential and use of biogas and biomethane in heavy-duty transport? I know there's a question as well in from one of our attendees that's linked to that. Is there any government support or incentive to supply renewable gas into transport for HGVs to decarbonise transport? So would you be able to comment on that, please?
Biogas and biomethane is, there is incentive within the policy because as long as that biomethane or biogas meets the sustainability criteria, which is aligned to RED 2, then it can get multiple certs. If it meets the criteria for Annex 9A feedstock as set out under RED 2, that's 2 certs. And subject to enabling legislation, we're also looking at a 1.5 multiplier for biomethane. So that is there. As well as that, there is the grant for the AFHTV grant for the purchase of alternatively fueled vehicles, which includes CNG vehicles. And in budget 2022, in last year, the government expanded the accelerated capital allowance grant for the purchase of equipment.
Okay, thanks very much, Valerie. So if I move to Lewis, again, I welcome you to the role in SEI, and thank you for joining us today. So would you be able to give us an update on the and again, my comment on the heat study from SEI is a very comprehensive piece of work. Can you outline maybe the main elements regarding bioenergy and the specific role of solid biomass and indeed biogas stroke biomethane in the decarbonisation of heat? And perhaps if you want to allude to your role as well in SEI, it's important that our attendees understand what you do in your role or what you're going to be doing as part of that.
So good morning to everyone. Yes, I'm recently joined the SEA, but I'm the program manager of the Bioenergy group regarding heat development. One of our main roles would be dissemination or developing the heat study that has been mentioned or recently issued by the SEI. It's one of the things along supporting public departments like Dept in developing related policies to the heat study. As for example, renewable heat obligation scheme, we will collaborate. We aim to collaborate with them in the future, along as well as the third side of our role would be support research related to bioenergy, collaboration with Science SFI in Ireland or IEA as well. Internationally speaking, we represent Ireland regarding international research being developed by IEA. That's a bit of a high summary of our role related to bioenergy. If I aim to describe the main elements regarding bioenergy and the heat study, I would aim to briefly introduce what is the heat study, which are the main parts of the heat study. It's been mentioned many times, but I think just 3 sentences describing what it is, what's the method of the heat study and what it aims to achieve. So the heat study is a decarbonization heat study for Ireland up to 2050, and it identifies the way it develops the calculation of the analysis is by first identifying the renewable supply of renewable fuels, and second, identifies the demand for that heat and tries to link both supplies and demand in a cost-optimal scenarios. got optimal ways. So when we say about supply of heat, of renewable heat, what do I mean by that? So it says what is the available local source of bioenergy, what is the local source of hydrogen, is it going to be available in the near future or not, which is not, should be imported, should be or not, should we grow more grass for future biomethane to be developed, yes or no, that kind of availability of supply, that's one side of it. And the second is the demand of heat and the requirements or limitations of those demands to adopt heat supplied by those renewable heats. I explain myself. Requirements and limitations would be, does the industry is capable to be supplied heat through heat pumps, yes or no? In general terms, industry process loads are high temp, so they wouldn't be that suitable for heat pumps, as an example. Would urban areas be suitable for district heating based on their heat density? Yes or no? The answer is more suitable. Would they be suitable through district heating through biomass? Yes, that's one of the options. Would heat pumps need additional retrofitting of dwellings in order to be viable, in order to be incorporated in supplying heat to the residential stock? Yes, in part of them they would need retrofit would be another variable to be added into another cost. Let's put it that way into the evaluation. And based on that availability of supply and that demand of heating requirements and limitations, then the heat study evaluates the cost optimal scenarios that reach into that decarbonized scenario in 2050 through the development of different fuels supplying to different demands. And it's a cost optimal scenario. They aim to optimize the cost of the operation and the construction of both the infrastructure of that eventual fuel supply. So that would be that will help us identify what is the main items from bioenergy into the heat study. So if we identify one of the results from the heat study, as I say, it identifies the cost optimal scenarios that arrive us to 2050 in different ways. One, we call them scenarios. Those ways, the way we call it in the studies, to scenarios. And one of these scenarios is the rapid progress scenario, which is more aligned with the objectives being mentioned this morning in terms of 5.1, 5.7 terawatts-hour of biomethane. That's aligned with, as I say, with one of the models from the SCAA, which is, again, the rapid progress scenario. And that rapid progress scenario identifies, I have it here, 5 ways of heat supply in 2050 to the heat demand in Ireland. One is electrification, and it will be / hydrogen supply. Another one is sustainable biomethane, and the word sustainable is important. Another one would be bioenergy carbon storage, which is to be developed. Next one is heat pump, district heating, could be electric, could be biomass, and solid biomass. From those ones that I've mentioned, there are 7, 4 or 5, correct me if I'm wrong, those 4 or 5 are bioenergy related. District heating could be biomass, could be bioenergy related, could be electric. But the rest of them that I've mentioned, just 2, except heat pumps and electrification of heat, could be hydrogen. The rest of them are all bioenergy related.
Okay, thank you. As a follow-on question, bioenergy, as you know, is very strictly governed by sustainability criteria under the RED II, and bioenergy is complementary to food production, forestry production, farming and waste management. I suppose the question I have for you is, how do we get this message across from a sustainability point of view? And I do understand that SEI is currently developing a future sustainability verification procedure for biomass fuels to be implemented in Ireland. So could you maybe take both questions in one, if you could, in terms of how do we get our message across about the sustainability aspects of bioenergy? And secondly, can you give us a brief outline of this work around the future sustainability verification procedure?
Yes. So in terms of, and it was mentioned before, so in terms of supporting development of future policies, SEA has been appointed as recently by, you want to have the exact number, by statutory instruction 350 to 2022. So very recently, SEA has been appointed as competent authority for the development of the future verification procedure of sustainable biomass fuels. Not yet bioliquids, not biofuels for transport, but biomass fuels for gaseous and solid biomass. And that verification procedure will set out the process that all biomass, solid biomass gas will need to go through in order to be certified as sustainable. And in order to do that, all I would say, I was going to say an industry, not that much an industry, but all an infrastructure of voluntary schemes, of certification bodies, of audit agents need to be implemented in the future, or in the near future, I would say, in order to that sustainability certification gets in place in Ireland. And if we are talking about, I think I heard 100, for example, 180 plants to be built up to 2030, that all those with a certain supply of biomethane, we would really aim all that biomethane to be certified as sustainable, obviously, and that needs to be audited. And that doesn't mean not just the biomethane production, but the supplies to the biomethane need to be as well, need to be certified. So in order to how to expand it further, we need to establish somehow a certification supply chain in order to support the biomass, sustainable biomass supply.
Okay,
yeah.
Thanks very much, Lewis, and we look forward to engaging with you and your colleagues in SEI around this future sustainability verification procedure. If I could bring in Noel. Noel, you work and manage the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme. You certify wood fuels to a quality standard, but you also check the verification from the point of view of sustainability. Can you outline what you do as part of the WFQA process from a sustainability perspective? So maybe a lot of what Lewis is talking about is actually currently being done through the WFQA voluntary scheme.
Yeah, so we set up the WFQA in 2009, and to date we have approximately 40 companies certified around the country for supply of firewood, wood chip, wood pellet and briquettes. And really it's based on three areas that we look for conformity, and the first is the sustainability of raw material. It's obviously critical that we have our sources of energy coming from sources we can stand over. Thankfully in Ireland most of our material is coming from forestry material, it's coming with felling licence information. We have a very good felling licence system. I know that people will have issue with how some of it operates, but in terms of how it manages sustainability, what Department of Agriculture put together and manage there, it does it very well. So we can stand over that very easily. So in terms of sustainability, we also look at willow crop, other grown materials and how that's managed. So in line with the RED 2 directive, the RED 3 directive, it all complies in through there. And it's important that we are able to stand over that and show, because as we go forward with the SRH and with other just private clients wanting to ensure that what they're using is having a positive impact, it's very important to be able to stand over it like that. Secondly, really it's looking at the quality of the material. In Ireland or across Europe, there's a standard set out, European standard debated for many years over the last 2 decades. They've set together quite a comprehensive standard which we use, and that standard sets out all biomass fuels. So whether it's literally everything from straw bales to wood pellet, it covers all of the criteria needed.
And if I could ask you, Noel, the importance of quality from a wood fuel perspective, if there's organisations and heat users here today that are looking at embracing the SSRH, can you outline the importance of quality and the distinction between, say, quality for domestic firewood consumption and also for more industrial chip boilers?
Yeah. Well, really on the domestic side of it, to get the both best value for the consumer and also the best value or the best environmental credentials, it really comes down to moisture content. It really comes down to, on a firewood basis, it comes down that it's properly dried, and that there's a regulation now coming in at 25% at the end of this month, which we've called for many years, and we're delighted to see that the department did take it up when we started meeting them about approximately 5 years ago and discussing this. But the 25% limit, and it'll be going down to 20 in a number of years, really has a dramatic impact on how clean burning the fuel will be, and also in terms of for the consumer, the efficiency. You will get a lot more heat. We've done experiments on this in the past and some trial work on this in the past in terms of how much heat you will get out of various moisture contents. So it's critical for the consumer as well as the environmental credentials of the fuel. And when I'm talking about environmental credentials, I'm talking about emissions from combustion, so particulate matter. And that's obviously, air quality is a considerable issue or a thing that we have to always be watching. On an industrial scale, then, it's more to do, generally, you're looking at chip. Pellet, we tend not to do much issues. Most of that is EN Plus certified, and it goes with, again, with the standard. It's a product that, we rarely see anything going wrong with pellet because the manufacturers do it at a very high standard. In chip, really, you're talking two things. One is the particle size and conformity of that. If you have long pieces, obviously, it's going to be blocking augers. But that's something we haven't seen much of in the last 5 years. As the quality of chippers has come up and they're very well designed, you generally don't see that sort of issue. And then it's moisture content. And it's really to do with that the moisture content matches the boiler that it's going into. Some boilers will want material at 30%, some will need it at 45 because of the way it's designed. So it's about matching the fuel and the moisture content to the actual appliance that it's going towards.
Okay. If I could just pick up one point that you made, you mentioned about how the WFQA members that are certified at the moment are compliant with the moisture content requirements. There is a concern about one element of the proposal around the bulk. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one of the things which we have issue with is that within the new regulations, for a reason we haven't fully understood, they put in a place where if you're providing more than 2 cubic meters to a consumer, that you don't have to comply with the 25% limit. And I think the idea of that is that somebody can buy a quantity themselves and dry it themselves. But it leaves it quite open to material of lower quality being used for combustion. And it's, most domestic consumers will not have facility to dry that and to make sure it's properly seasoned. So that is something we've seen. It was in the EU regs. It appears to have come from there. It's not within the EU standards. It's not allowed at all. We particularly don't like it. And it's not something we are embracing in the WFQA or even certifying people to. If people want to go for that, they can do it under a different, on a different scheme. We won't be.
And it's something you're engaging with the department and
yes.
people in the air quality division on.
And we are quite accepting and happy to see that there is regulation coming forward for domestic fuels, but they haven't gone the full step forward that they could have.
Okay. Just a final question for you, Noel. Since this panel is about regulation, and Michelle mentioned it, the ABP regulations for biogas plants, can you just give us your own perspectives on those and the importance of the IrBEA regulations?
Yeah, it's something that we've been engaged for IrBEA for about 15 years in the ABP forum with the Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment, EPA, and other industry bodies. And essentially, it set together a full set of criteria that if you have any animal byproducts going into a composting plant, a digestion plant, that the criteria that's needed to ensure biosecurity. Ultimately, it's controlled by the vets within the Department of Agriculture, and from their point of view, the food crop, the animal herd, is sacrosanct, and protecting the health of that herd is obviously important. And this goes back to foot and mouth and things like that you want to ensure that the material that's going back out on land, the digestate, is going to be safe to go back out. And so in fairness, to put together, they're quite robust standards. Some of the things, obviously there was a lot of negotiation that went on in that in years past. But
and different size of plant has different requirements.
And in fairness, where there was a lot of discussions and a lot of heavy discussions over the different elements for industrial scale plants, when we came forward with the idea that we need to be also looking at a farm scale digester. This is where a farmer will put in their own digester just to deal with their own materials. In fairness, they put together a very short, comprehensive document. Essentially it's about 5 pages, but 1 page of regulations compared to the 25 for an industrial scale plant. And it's relative to the size it's there, and it works.
So am I correct in saying, Noel, that the ABP, Animal Byproducts Regulations, determines what's a farm biogas plant and what's not? So people that talk about 35, 40, 50,000 tonnes of material going into a biogas plant or an anaerobic digestion plant and calling that a farm-based plant, that's not correct in the eyes of the regulation. A farm-based plant is a very specific
Under ABP,
Yes.
the Type 9 plant is basically called under their own the system that's there, and it's very specific in terms of what can go into that plant.
Okay. Okay. Just before we finish up, just a couple of comments that are coming through on the Slido. You'll be glad to hear no real questions, but more feedback. So I just quickly run through them. Just the one that got the most likes, the department has yet to officially publish a decision on the RHO, and it's maybe kind of a question, Tony. Could Tony commit to maybe publishing a statement that would give market certainty about the introduction, despite the fact that the design of the scheme is currently being run through in this consultation process? But it's just something that is being suggested here, that the department publish a statement outlining their intention to introduce an RHO. So I won't ask you to comment, but it's some, or maybe.
Yeah, no, look, it's something that's we're working on.
Okay, thank you. Valerie, you've addressed the comment about the supports for gas into transport to decarbonise heavy transport, so we've touched on that. A general comment here, not enough support for biomethane production. Is government going to row in and facilitate the setting up and running of a sector? So I think we've discussed the various, what's required in terms of doing that, RHO being one of the ways, and there's need for other mechanisms to fund it. Comment here, we need to promote and support the use of solid biomass for domestic heating. Huge immediate benefits, and WFQA scheme ensures high quality and low emissions. And that's linked to a second question. Using sustainably produced solid biomass is an excellent way to reduce carbon emissions and reduce or increase our contribution to renewable heat targets. Would the government consider introducing a domestic support for biomass? So again, it's certainly something which I know we've discussed with people in the department, and is something that we're currently working on in terms of a report. Just to let our delegates know today, we're working on a report on this particular area to give us the evidence that we need in order to go to the department to lobby for an introduction for domestic support, SRH, similar to the SRH scheme for non-domestic. And then a final point, great to hear Michelle speak about AD and biomethane, and a challenge to GNI, which we'll have Pádraig on the panel later, about whether GNI are on the same page from the point of view of an industry and developing an industry. So look, we look forward to discussing that with Pádraig and colleagues on the last panel later this afternoon. So they were the questions and the feedback we received. So I think that I've covered them all. So we will conclude at that. I thank very much Tony, Michelle, Valerie, Lewis and Noel for this, your panel.